Okay, so we're about three after, so we will begin and people will just continue to join. We will let folks into the room to listen to our presentation. So let me start by saying on behalf of the OCFS, Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility, I want to say hello and thank you for joining us today. As we get started, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like by sharing your name, your pronouns, and your program area, just so we have a sense of who's joined today. And I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Karen Sessions. My pronouns are she, her, and I work here in the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility as the SOGI officer, which stands for Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, and Expression. And I'm so excited that Dr. Teller has come back to OCFS to present again on the Trevor Project CARE program. This presentation is important for so many reasons, and one of them being that ongoing exposure for all of us to presentations like this helps all of us build our understanding about the challenges faced by youth who identify as part of the LGBTQIA+ community. And this presentation is also quite timely because September is Suicide Awareness Month. And also, given the challenging legal and political attacks this community is experiencing, the need to bring attention and focus on how we can best support children, youth, and families who are LGBTQIA+ identified continues to be a heightened priority of our office. And so again, it is my pleasure to reintroduce Dr. Kyle Teller, who is a public training manager for the Trevor Project, who also presented here back in March of this year. And I just want to thank Kyle personally, and I want to pass the mic to her. So welcome.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And yes, we are in Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. So thank you all for joining us here today. Now, I'm going to start off, and just as a gentle reminder, if you need to take 5 or take a breath, you're more than welcome to. I'm really mindful not to share graphic depictions of suicide, but we will talk about some suicide data and impact, and then of course, ways to help prevent a death by suicide. So let's start today. So once again, hi, I'm Kyle Teller. I'm the Senior Public Training Manager with Trevor, and my pronouns are she, her. Now for our agenda today, we are looking at suicide facts or myths, understanding suicide, so that's the data and impact component, risk factors, warning signs, and protective factors, and then other ways you can help as well as resources. Now, things to keep in mind, this is only the beginning. So everything you learn here, put into practice in your daily life. So friends, community, family, we want folks to talk about mental health. Now, everyone is going to have different experiences, both being maybe part of the LGBTQ community like myself, or outside, or with mental health, or even as in terms of knowledge. Every single person here is welcome. So this is non-judgmental, so keep an open mind, especially if maybe this is your first, or maybe if this is your dozenth training on mental health and LGBTQIA. I want everyone to know to take something away today, to put into practice, and to help others learn with you. Now, if you haven't heard of us before, I'm part of the Trevor Project. We are the leading suicide prevention and crisis intervention organization for LGBTQ+ young people. Now, at Trevor, we define young people as those ages 24 and under, but our goal for every young person is that they see a brighter future for themselves. So our work has 2 main departments, as we call them, or arms of Trevor. But one side of Trevor is our confidential crisis programs. Now, you might have heard that we lost our 988 funding and partnership, and that is unfortunately true. That means that we have lost a lot of crisis working staff. However, we still are operating 24/7, 365 with our Trevor Crisis Classic Lifelines. Now, we do anticipate, because of the loss of other folks that were working on our crisis lines and really dedicated to getting them support, that it might mean that there could be longer wait times. It really is dependent, as all of this is so new. I do want folks to be reassured we still are here 24/7. So LGBTQ young folks can call in either if they just want to talk about their mental health or their experience with a trained counselor, a live trained counselor on our staff, who is a part of either Trevor Chat, Lifeline, or Text. So with chat, they can go on our website and chat with a live person. Lifeline, phone in, text, just as it sounds, text. Now, on another side of Trevor, we don't want to just address a crisis when it happens. We want to also help remove barriers that increase the likelihood of a crisis for an LGBTQ plus young person. So we have our prevention programs. And so in these programs, we have things like Trevor Space. This is the world's largest safe space for LGBTQ plus young folks. So for those 13 to 24, Trevor Space is their social media site. We moderate it for safety, but it shows, and we have new research actually from our incredible research team here, that for LGBTQ plus young people, some social media sites can be a boost for their mental health, because they don't have to defend who they are to someone who gets it, someone who shares their identity or knows where they've been. They can just say, hey, this is my favorite movie, or hey, I'm struggling to come out to this friend at school. Can I walk this through with someone here who might have had a similar experience? It's what they want to make it, and it's there to empower them. It is divided into 2 age ranges. So 13 to 17 is in one group and 18 to 24 is in another. And like I said, our moderators are there to ensure it's a safe and supportive environment, but otherwise it really is for them to have a space, particularly if they don't have an in-person space in their community that's safe or a place where they can be part of. Now, our research team, as I said, just released another amazing data point where they were saying that our LGBTQ plus young people can be boosted by certain social media sites, especially those that are supportive. But they also do something really important annually, that is the Mental Health Among LGBTQ plus Youth Survey. So this last year alone, they collected data from multiple countries, and I'll mention here the US. In the US alone, they collected over 18,000 responses from LGBTQ plus young people who shared what's impacting their mental health. So they're telling us, hey, this new legislation is impacting my mental health. This is what allies can do to support me. And a big one, as we'll see here today, is trusting that I know who I am was number 1 on their list. They want their allies to trust that they know who they are better than you do. So that's part of what our research does. They also do so much in LGBTQ plus mental health. If it relates to the mental health of a queer young person, they likely have data on it and have published it in peer-reviewed journals. We have those briefs of those journal articles on our website available for the public as well. Now, advocacy. Our advocacy team works at the local, state, and federal level. So this could be your grassroots organization. It could be working directly with legislators. Their work is to promote good bills that protect LGBTQ plus people and help defeat harmful bills. Now, I will say a lot of their efforts in the last few years have been working to defeat harmful bills, because record high have entered legislation. That does not mean they've passed. This last year alone, we helped defeat over 80% of those anti-LGBTQ plus bills that entered legislation. So it does mean that we need folks to rally together to help fight bills that target LGBTQ plus people. Now, last but not least, this is my team, this is education. I work with adults all over the country to work on suicide prevention and LGBTQ plus allyship. If you can think of an adult, a group of people who work with young people, I have likely worked with that group. So it could be your librarians, it could be your PTA, it could be the school attendants, and that's just school. It could be legislators. It could be folks at organizations and other nonprofits. It could be those working in suicide prevention. There are so many different groups that form who are seeking this education. So I work with everyone so that way we get these foundational principles to help others. Now for this next part, I am going to do an activity with you all. This is our opener where we're going to discuss facts and myths about suicide. So I'm going to share a statement on the screen with you, and I want in the chat for you to chime in with whether or not you think it's a fact or a myth. And I do not believe in punitive testing, so there is nothing that happens if you guess wrong. All that means is you learned, and we love learning here. So this first one, suicide happens without warning. Fact or myth? Chime in the chat. Yes, I'm seeing, there's some variance, but this is a myth. There are warning signs. It's just, what is our proximity to assess warning signs? And do we recognize what those warning signs look like? I do want folks to know that it is on no one person's shoulders to prevent a death by suicide. This is a community effort. This is something we all have to know the warning signs for to understand how to look for them. And we'll discuss warning signs today together, but there are typically warning signs accompanying suicide. All right, here's another statement. People who attempt suicide are weak, crazy, or selfish. Fact or myth? Seeing a lot in the chat. Pretty much a consensus with this one. It is a myth. So it can be really harmful to use this kind of language, especially around mental health and suicide, because it means people are less likely to seek support. But unfortunately, this is a myth that we all likely have heard in some form or another about mental health and suicide. So when you hear this myth, I ask people who want to help prevent suicide to interrupt this myth. And there's a number of ways you can do it, but saying things like, hey, I don't believe they're weak. I believe it's strong to seek support. Model the behavior you want to see from others is one technique. Another technique is asking the person to reflect. Hey, when you say someone is weak who attempts suicide, how is that helping them get support? Getting them to think about that. Yeah. And even that, I believe it is strong to seek help. So remember, model the behavior, but also ask them to reflect on their impact. Can be really powerful to interrupt these myths. All right, another statement. People who talk about suicide are just trying to get an attention and are not really going to make an attempt. Fact or myth? Okay, I'm seeing a lot here. Myth. Yes. So, and here's the thing, for those folks where you've heard someone say they're just doing it to get attention, we unfortunately live in a time where attention has been demonized, but when someone is looking for a quote unquote attention, what they're seeking is help. Help and seeking support is a strength because without that, they are suicidal, alone, and isolated. And that means they could be at increased risk of a suicide attempt. So when we see attention and we hear this, we know culturally that attention is sometimes demonized as an idea. But what we can say is, hey, in the 0.0000001% chance that they're doing this quote for attention, what's the risk? Because the risk of not believing them is a death by suicide. So remember, when you hear this myth or a variation of it, interrupt that to get people to reflect on the harm and the impact that could be done, whether or not that's their intent. And it's usually not their intent, but we need to reflect on our words and actions to understand better. All right, here's another statement. If you talk about suicide, you're giving people ideas. Fact or myth? This is a tricky one sometimes, but it is a myth. So there are constructive ways to talk about suicide, but this statement itself is a generalizing statement where they're just saying, talk about suicide gives people ideas. Actually, no, by opening up dialogue about suicide, we're making it easier for people to seek that support to help prevent a death by suicide. So it means the person can trust you because we're already talking about it. All right, another statement. There's nothing you can do to stop someone who really wants to kill themselves. Fact or myth? Seeing some in the chat, letting folks. And this is a complicated one too, but the big word here is nothing. There are things we can do. And as I said earlier, it's on no one person's shoulders to prevent a death, but there are things we can do to prevent suicide. Suicide is a preventable death. But it means we need to look for the warning signs. We need to create a culture that, again, interrupts those harmful ideas around talking about mental health and seeking support. It means connecting people to crisis services and so much more. I'm going to go through some of that here today on what we can do with someone who's in crisis to offer them support. All right, last one. A suicidal person will always be suicidal. Fact or myth? I'm seeing a lot here too. Myth. Always, again, big generalization word. We don't know what tomorrow is going to be for that person. What we can offer someone is what we're capable of offering them. So we can say, I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to stick with you and be by your side. For that person, they might be suicidal for a day, weeks, months, years. They might have that for a long time until they get the appropriate support for themselves. But just like we don't say it gets better at Trevor, because we can't just say it's magically going to get better tomorrow or with this one thing that we haven't tried yet. We can hold out hope. And we also don't know that they're going to be suicidal tomorrow. We cannot predict the future in that way. We do know there are interventions that can be really effective. And we do know what we can offer that person and say, hey, I don't know how you're feeling, and I'd like to know more about how you're feeling. Let's talk together. Let's go on a walk together. Let's share something. So remember that always is a big trick here. We want to respect where the person is and how long they've felt suicidal, but we can still hold out hope, offer support, connect them to services. And remember that always is not a guarantee. Now, thank you for doing that. As you saw, those were myths, but they are ones that we see so often. And it can be a bit of a trip because when we look at some of those, it seems like, well, okay, well, that could be a fact under these conditions. But in overall, when we're saying we want to talk about suicide, it's because we're not talking about suicide outside of certain spaces. We need to make it the cultural norm to talk about suicide even before a crisis happens. So now I'm going to discuss some suicide data so we understand the picture of suicide in the US. So over a 20-year period, suicide has steadily risen by 37%. So we see a big rise, but it's increased 37% over that 20+ year period. Now, I will note there was a small blip around 2020-ish where it went down just a tish, but then it went steadily up again. Suicide is the 9th leading cause of death for those across all backgrounds, ages 10 to 64. Suicide is the 8th leading cause of death among children ages 5 to 11. Now, again, we know this is a public health crisis because it's preventable, but we're seeing it as some of the leading causes of death across all demographics. Now, if we zoom in, we see that for children ages 10 to 14, suicide is the 2nd leading cause of death. It is only second to an fatal accident such as car crash or fall. It is the 3rd leading cause of death for those ages 15 to 24. For our queer young people, we see that they have a 39% have seriously considered a suicide attempt this last year. That's 4 times more likely than their peers. And this doesn't come from nowhere. 60% reported experiencing discrimination for being LGBTQ+. And that's just what a young person could name as discrimination. Likely it takes years to understand, oh, that was discrimination I was experiencing. Now, 1.8 million plus LGBTQ plus youth seriously consider suicide every year. They are attempting to get support, but there are barriers to mental health support. So 50% did want mental health counseling, but could not access it this last year. Now, I want to understand that even though we are up against a lot when it comes to suicide and risk, particularly for LGBTQ plus young people, we can make a difference. When an LGBTQ plus young person feels supported by an adult in their lives, their odds of a suicide attempt decrease in most cases by 40%. 40% is a massive reduction in suicide attempt. And when I say that an LGBTQ youth feels supported, I do mean support. That means I accept and see you for who you are, just as you are. Now, whenever we talk about this data, and I do help you talk about this with others as well and help educate, it's an important reminder to be really clear that it is not someone's identity that puts them at risk. It's society's response to that identity. It's the mistreatment, the stigma, the discrimination that puts our LGBTQ plus young people at risk of suicide attempts. It is not just because they're LGBTQ plus. Now, I mentioned 50% of LGBTQ plus youth who sought mental health care couldn't access it this last year. They gave us their top 10 reasons why, but they break down into 3 main categories. Category 1 is accessibility. Healthcare is hard to access in the United States. So one example of that is I could not afford it. That was one of their highest reasons as well. Now, another big category reason for not being able to access mental health care was mental health stigma, the fear of talking about your mental health with someone, because again, culturally, it's not common, unfortunately, in most places to be able to feel that you will be accepted and receive support for talking about your mental health care. We have so much stigma we need to combat. So in number 1, I was afraid to talk about my mental health care concerns with someone else. Now, one of the third main categories this falls under is LGBTQ plus stigma. And this actually relates to both accessibility and mental health care stigma. They all inform one another, particularly if you identify as queer like I do. So you might be unable to afford it, but we also know that LGBTQ plus people experience disproportionate job discrimination, which is linked to access to mental health care. So how do you even afford it if you can't get that access? Now, for young people too, LGBTQ plus stigma could be, hey, I need to get my parent or caregiver's permission to even get this access. But to do so, it might unintentionally out me to them, and they might not be safe for me to be out with, or I just don't want or am ready to be out with them. Now, there are other challenges in mental health care, and there's a long and unfortunate history in mental health where previously, and this is decades and decades ago now, but we still see this happen, unfortunately, where instead of seeing LGBTQ plus people and treating the harms that stigma caused them, instead, our identities were seen as the thing to cure. We see this in the form of, for example, conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is the incredibly harmful and illegitimate practice that tries to forcibly change an LGBTQ person's identity. Not only does it not work, but it astronomically increases someone's risk of a suicide attempt. Unfortunately, we still see this allowed and permitted in many states. So when we talk about LGBTQ plus stigma, it could look like a fear of they could try and suggest conversion therapy, or that could be something that they try to do with my parents' permission. It could also be involuntary hospitalization because someone sees who you are as the problem rather than the stigma and barriers you're up against as key factors to your mental health crisis that you might be experiencing. Now, as a reminder that we're up against a lot, that one accepting adult can make a huge difference in reducing suicide risk and suicide attempts. Now, there are constructive ways to talk about suicide because we do want to talk about suicide. So we have some updated phrasing considerations for everyone here. Now, on the left-hand side, you'll see phrases that we no longer use. One, they're inaccurate, but two, they also pass judgment. So when we see phrases like committed suicide, that suggests criminalization language, the idea of being committed. It also passes judgment, and it can make harder for the person who's experiencing suicidal ideation, those thoughts or behaviors. We also see terms we no longer use, such as successful attempt, unsuccessful attempt, or failed attempt. This again passes judgment on the person. It's suggesting that a suicide attempt could be a good thing or a success, or that the person is quote unquote a failure for a suicide attempt that was again non-lethal. We want to use accurate and neutral language when we talk about suicide. So died by suicide is accurate and neutral. Lethal or non-lethal attempt, or just an attempt. So remember when we talk about suicide, and you might still see some of this language maybe in some more outdated articles or things of that like, but we do want to update to make sure that it's both accurate and neutral. We are not here to pass judgment. Anyone can experience suicidal ideation or behaviors. There are certain factors that increase someone's risk, but again, this is a really common struggle that we do not want to either demonize or claim success over. Now, I mentioned there's risk factors that may increase the likelihood of a suicide attempt. So some of these risk factors are mental health conditions, accessibility to means of suicide, and in particular, firearms, which is why we do advise when there's a firearm in a home that it is moved off-site to another location and also in a safe box. If that is not possible, it should still be put into a safe where only one person knows the code who is not in crisis or dealing with a mental health struggle. Now, experiencing homelessness, family crises, academic pressure, non-suicidal self-injury. So for example, cutting, it could be skin picking or other self-harm, loss or grief, victimization, and history of suicide in the family. Now, I want to be really clear with these risk factors. These are often not at the person's choice. These are conditions that are put on them because of maybe experiences that put them at greater risk of discrimination for their identity. So LGBTQ youth are at higher risk of experiencing homelessness, and that could be due to one factor like family rejection. That's not their fault. On the family level, if a family is in crisis, it could be because they're experiencing maybe housing instability or dealing with their own mental health as well. So we want to be sure not to pass judgment on people as we consider risk factors, but just be aware that they could increase the likelihood that someone may have a suicide attempt. Now, the ones I'm going to highlight now disproportionately impact our LGBTQ plus young people. Experiencing homelessness, family crises, and I did mention when it's disproportionate for LGBTQ plus youth, we do see the family crises is sometimes family rejection for being who they are. And that experiencing homelessness can be related to that. And if they experience homelessness, they are also, while not listed here, at an increased risk of involvement with juvenile justice and then later imprisonment. Because if you are, say, a 13-year-old who is homeless, your access to getting a job, to get food, to get shelter, to get any form of safety has drastically gone out the window. So unfortunately, without access to resources, basic needs, and care, that means they are more likely to have engagement with juvenile justice, where instead of getting appropriate resources for what they are trying to do, such as could be panhandling is sometimes what it's called, they could experience criminalization. They're also at increased risk of experiencing trafficking because of these experiences of family rejection and homelessness. Now, non-suicidal self-injury among LGBTQ youth, we see this often as a coping mechanism, actually. So when someone has a coping mechanism, particularly if they're in crisis, but regardless, we don't remove the coping mechanism in full, even if it is causing self-injury. We work with the person to ask them, what feelings does this bring up when you do this activity or action? How could we have that feeling come up in a different way? So helping them look for alternative coping mechanisms and then helping them lessen the harm they might be causing to themselves with non-suicidal self-injury. So for some folks, that could be saying, hey, is there something you've wanted to try but haven't tried yet? And how are you feeling about this non-suicidal self-injury? And you mirror the language the person is using. So it could just be reduction as the primary focus if they're open to it. But what we do not advise is just removing their coping mechanism. Because if that's how they're coping, that might be the one thing getting them through the day. Now, loss or grief and victimization, we also see this disproportionately impact LGBTQ plus youth. And in particular, those who have multiple marginalized identities, that intersection of identities. So for example, a Black trans girl is going to be at higher risk of all these risk factors because she's more likely to experience anti-trans hate and discrimination, but also racism and anti-Blackness happening at the same time. And because she's also a girl, she could have experiences with misogyny that put her at higher risk. So we want to take into account all parts of a person that can impact their risk factors. Now, I mentioned that intersection of identity, and we have a term for this, intersectionality. This term was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, and originally the context was about legal proceedings because Black women were getting fired and let go at a much higher rate than others. And the companies were saying, well, it's not discrimination because we still have Black men working for us, and we still have white women. So they weren't acknowledging the issue was that they were targeting someone for being not just Black and not a white woman, but being both a Black woman at the same time. So that intersection works for all of us to inform our daily experiences with privilege and oppression. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw herself broadened intersectionality to include all forms of social categories, whether that's class, documentation status, sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, and so forth. But as I mentioned earlier, when we look at two people, even within our queer community, they're going to have drastically different experiences. I'm a queer disabled white woman. That informs my daily experience. As a white woman, I know I walk into a store and I am not checked for my receipt on the way out. As a queer woman, I'm also going to make sure, just on a very back of the brain level, that if I'm seeking healthcare, I really look into if they're allied and what that actually means for them. And sometimes I don't have options because of how our healthcare works in the United States. And that's just not even a footnote often in the day, but these are just different considerations that we may or may not reflect on, and we should. Now, it should come as no surprise, but we want to acknowledge that minority stress produces suicide risk. So again, it's not that you're a part of a minority group that is creating harm. Everyone in a marginalized community can likely experience their joy and get boost from the community. I love being queer. That is not the issue for me. The issues are stigma, discrimination, and rejection from others based on your identity. So minority stress is compounded for those who are more likely to experience what we call multiple discrimination. So I gave an example earlier of a Black trans girl. And again, she can get a lot of love and support and joy from her Black trans community. We also want to acknowledge that she could experience discrimination from both inside and outside her communities. So within the trans community, she might experience anti-Blackness. In the Black community, she might experience anti-trans bias. So in every community, we want to be aware of different factors that are impacting us and make them better spaces for all. Now, when we see someone who could be in a potential for crisis, we want to acknowledge how stressors impact them differently as well. So I'm going to give the example of prom, a fairly common high school experience for our young people. Now, if a white, cisgender, straight boy is experiencing the stress of prom, again, he's probably under a lot of stress. You might be asking someone out. He might be afraid of what to wear. There could be other factors, but it's unlikely to put him above the threshold and into a place of crisis. But for our queer young people who are considering prom, they have other variables that they have to navigate, and those are barriers that first child did not have to navigate. They have to wonder, am I allowed to go to prom as myself? Am I allowed to actually dress how I feel I would want to dress for prom? And this could be through gender expression of a way that's gender non-conforming. And they might also have to ask, am I allowed to even ask my date and bring them? Will their family accept me? Will my family accept them? How will we get there? Will we experience bullying from our peers or even staff? So there is a lot more that could be a stressor from the same event because they don't have access to the same resources and supports and face additional barriers. Now, with suicide, I did mention earlier that there are warning signs we want to be on the lookout for. Each of these independently that I'm about to show you can be a warning sign for suicide. It could also be a sign of another mental or physical health condition happening, but we do want to consider that they could be a warning sign for suicide and talk with the person in the steps I'll show you in our training throughout. So if they talk or communicate in any way about killing themselves, feeling hopeless, no reason to live, a burden, or language in that avenue, we want to take that as a warning sign of suicide. For behaviors, increasing substance use, withdrawing from activities or loved ones, drastic changes in sleep habits. This could also be visiting or calling people to say goodbye, giving away possessions, fatigue as well. And then if we look at mood, it really does run the gamut here in terms of including depression, anxiety, loss of interest, irritability, shame or humiliation, anger, major or sudden mood changes. But we also want to look out for relief or sudden improvement. If they've been suicidal or experiencing crisis for a long time, and all of a sudden we see a relief or sudden improvement, that is a warning sign of suicide. So we still want to check in with the person because relief or sudden improvement could be a sign that they've made a decision and that to them, they're at peace with that decision. It could also be a sign that they're trying to appear that they're okay because they've also made a plan. There's a number of reasons, but we still want to treat this as a warning sign of suicide. Now, I mentioned that for LGBTQ plus young folks, and even as adults, there are additional stressors to consider that can impact someone's likelihood of being in crisis. Not fitting into gender norms. Again, it's not the person's gender identity or expression that's the risk. It's how society responds to their gender. Rejection from coming out, particularly at a young age. This can also be a source of joy if they're supported for coming out. If they're saying, I see and love you just as you are. That's support. That's not a stressor. So coming out can be good. Coming out isn't the risk, it's the rejection. Discrimination and victimization, and then also developmental stressors. So I mentioned even the idea of prom, that's part of your little development experience, are accessing certain parts of childhood and adolescence. And even if we look big picture, the ability to join sports, the ability to go to a school without experiencing extensive discrimination or bias from both staff and peers, seeing yourself in the curriculum, the list goes on and on. But those developmental stressors can increase the likelihood of someone being in crisis. Now, there are protective factors, those good things that help boost resilience. So LGBTQ plus young folks told us that the following topics would be helpful for adults in their lives to know: support and acceptance, gender identity, sexual orientation, pronouns, how to create safer spaces, learning that the gender binary has not been a consistent place in history. It has not been a consistent idea, and that it is not the only way to think about gender. microaggressions, racism, and intersectionality as well. Now, for protective factor examples, this is a list that they came up with of some of the common ones: straight and cisgender allies, therapy and medication, gender affirming clothing. It could be seeing happy queer elders and married couple. And there's a lot of research that, unfortunately, for queer young people, and in particularly queer Black young people, they don't see a future for themselves beyond the age of 30 because they expect to experience violence and harm instead of support. So caregivers, parents, family, community members, and other adults can help change that picture, as can seeing happy queer Black elders and people doing a lot of variety. We talk about why representation matters a lot when you're queer, but it actually does shape your likelihood of understanding I can have a future. Even though we know the risks are very real, we also know our community is incredibly supportive and that there are so many ways to be queer and have a good life. Now, there's other things such as queer role models, and there's other just sources of joy like cooking, living as my authentic self, drag shows, dance, LGBTQ clubs on campus. So all of these help boost resilience and the ability to bounce back from hardship. Now, I'm going to play this brief video on empathetic listening as we start talking about how to talk to someone in crisis.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So that was Dr. Brene Brown, and we use this video because it really does break down empathetic listening very well and reflect what we model at Trevor, which is reflecting language back to someone. If they say, I'm in a bad way, I am depressed, I'm suicidal, we mirror that back and say, hey, I'm hearing you say you're suicidal. I care about you. Let's chat. What is feeling suicidal like for you? Validate and normalize. And so this can look a number of ways, but we want them to know they're not alone, but also that this is unique to them. Their experiences can only be felt by them. Stay present and non-judgmental. Like in the video, this is something where instead of saying, oh, look over here, we need to stay with them in that feeling instead of trying to force them out of that feeling, because that's not going to work. Use minimal encouragers. This can look like head nodding, going, anything to show that you are paying attention and actively engaged with them. I like to do a check with people where I say, hey, while we chat, what would make you feel most comfortable? Would you like to go for a walk? Would you like me to look over here if they don't love eye contact, for example, just to give them ideas? And then, of course, express care, concern, and encouragement. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't even know what to say. I'm just so glad you told me. Because you might be caught off guard. You might not know what to say, and that's true. But being glad that they told you can be a huge relief to hear. Now, we call this our care program because we connect the person to resources and services. We accept and listen to the person's feelings. I really want to hone that in. We accept where they're at with their feelings. We don't try and force them out of it. We're there to listen and engage with them. We respond if the person has a plan to attempt suicide and empower them to reach out to places like us at the Trevor Project. Now, remember, all you can do is listen, support, and assist the person in getting help. You are not personally responsible for anyone who has a suicide attempt. Now, how this conversation can look like in action. We want to start by listening, validating, and acknowledging. So they say, I'm done, I'm over this, I can't take it anymore. We can say and mirror, I hear you say you just can't take it anymore. Now, this is the one question we never paraphrase. It needs to be kept the same every time, and we do need to ask, are you thinking about killing yourself? We don't say, are you thinking about harming yourself? Are you having negative thoughts? We do need to ask directly, are you thinking about killing yourself? And anything but a no, we take as a yes, because the risk is too high. And express your care, concern, and again, encouragement. It sounds like you're in a lot of pain. I'm here for you. Now, if someone has answered with the question, are you thinking of killing yourself? With anything but a no, they said, I don't know, I'm unsure, maybe a shrug. We do need to assess using the risk assessment. How are you thinking about killing yourself? When are you thinking about killing yourself? Where are you thinking about killing yourself? Now, in each of these, there's different risk assessments to measure. So if they say, how are you thinking about killing yourself? And they have access to means, they are higher risk. So you are not responsible for knowing what means could cause the death of an individual. If they say something like over-the-counter medication, you don't need to be online looking up how much could kill a person. Just assume it can. Again, we just assume because we want to make sure we're assessing risk. And that is not your responsibility to know how a means of suicide could kill someone. You just need to assume it can. When are you thinking about killing yourself? If it's within 48 hours, we again put that more at imminent risk. Where are you thinking about killing yourself? They might say something like, well, the park. You want to follow up and say, where are you in relation to the park right now? And they might say, I'm 2 miles away. Follow up. Do you have access to get to the park today? And they might say, I don't actually have car, bike to get there. I'm not going there. Okay, a little lower risk. But if they answered and they have access to means within 48 hours and they have access to the location, they are in imminent risk and we need to connect them to crisis services. If they don't have access to their means, it's not within 48 hours and location, again, isn't something that they actually can get to, then we can go and move on to what brought on these thoughts today. And this does take practice. But remember, you're just there to ask questions. You're not providing solutions. You're not solving this today. And again, with suicide, the solution is always to keep talking and making sure the person has access to support and services. Now, if someone is in crisis and you are unable to be there, remember we are here at Trevor with our crisis lines. So these questions are important to ask, and you can do repeated check-ins. Asking someone, are you thinking of killing yourself, might not be a one and done thing and rarely is. So when we ask questions, once we've assessed risk, and if they're not an imminent risk or high risk where we need to contact crisis services or get them support, we can ask them more open-ended questions. So we like open-ended questions because it keeps the conversation going and empowers them. Again, we're not there to say you should do this. That's not really going to be as helpful as asking them to think about what's helpful to them. So instead of what we might see in the next slide, which is, well, depression is only like this, we're lecturing, that's not true. We ask questions like, what is depression like for you? And then allow them to guide the conversation. I'm here to listen. What would you like to talk about? So, and again, the solution when we're talking about solving things, it's the solving is an ongoing process because we're talking about someone in crisis. So you're there to ask questions, assess risk, connect them, the whole care method. But what we like to avoid while having conversations with someone in crisis after assessing risk is making sure we're using open-ended questions. So on the left, we have what we avoid, the directive questions. These are usually pretty judgy. They also try and tell someone what would make it better. And you might not know that that will make it better. So instead of saying, you don't want to do that, do you? It's judgy, it could put someone on the defensive. We can say, what do you think you want to do? Empowers them, gets them to think, still having the conversation. Why do you want to do that? That why, again, could put someone on the defensive. Help me understand what's making you want to do that. Getting them to reflect, and again, empowering them to share. This is what I call predicting the future, which we really can't do. You might start a fight if you challenge them. We might think that, we might know from past experience, this could be a likelihood of whatever situation is going on. It's not really going to be as helpful to them if we just tell them, hey, your choice is going to have this bad outcome. This works for a lot of different people, but getting them to reflect on what could be the outcome from themselves. What do you think would happen? Here's another one where it's advice giving. If my partner were doing that, I'd want them to stop. What do you want them to do? How would you like them to treat you? How would you like to treat others? Gets them to reflect on what they deserve to be treated like instead of just saying, oh, I wouldn't accept that for myself. And here's another one. This is just full out resource directive where you're saying yoga would help you. Maybe it's helped you as an individual, maybe lavender, maybe a weighted blanket, maybe therapy, maybe XYZ and so forth. But that's not empowering the person to find what works for them. So asking, what is there something you've thought about trying but haven't, can be really helpful because they might remember, you know, I used to paint and I liked it and it did help me just to sit and have time. And they might say, well, I don't know if I can do it anymore. Then follow up and say, what is making you feel like you can't do it anymore? So again, keep that open-ended framing and keep the conversation going. Now, if you ever do need to leave the conversation after assessing risk, be sure to offer them a connection to crisis services and say, hey, who can you call to keep this conversation going? I don't want to leave you hanging, and I do want to continue talking with you. And then actually set up a plan and say, I'd like to chat with you tomorrow night, this time. I'm going to call you, or however the form of communication works. So they know that you're not leaving them, but also make sure that they do have support and someone they can contact. And Trevor is, of course, an option. How would you feel about contacting the Trevor Project? Again, if you're leaving the conversation, you want to make sure that they still have someone to talk to. Now, all of those steps are for suicide risk assessment to make sure that they are supported, that we're engaged in conversation. There are other ways, of course, to act as an ally that can help reduce those barriers that increase the risk of our queer young people being more likely to have a suicide attempt. So exercising empathy, checking our bias, our opinions don't dictate whether or not we respect someone. Use inclusive language. So just like with mental health, you mirror the language back. If they say, I'm so anxious, I feel just so spirally, we can mirror that back. It also works for someone's identity. If they say, hey, I'm a queer person, say, hey, thanks for sharing that you're queer with me. Mirror the language that they use for themselves. And be intentional and thoughtful about your thoughts and questions. And usually for LGBTQ folks, and I will say marginalized folks in general, I'm an educator by choice and trade, so I invite questions. But every queer person that you meet is not an educator by choice and trade. There are so many scholars and resources, especially on our Trevor website and by reaching out to me and my team where you can learn more. So facilitate inclusive pronouns. Folks might not know this, but actually using and respecting someone's pronouns does help prevent suicide. It does. It shows them, I see you for who you are and I respect you. So you can make this a cultural norm by saying, I'm going to use pronouns when I introduce myself, not just among queer people, but in my community, in my workplace, in my email signature. Speak out against anti-queer sentiments, whether that takes the form of microaggressions, bias, discrimination. And as I said earlier, you can model the behavior you want to see in the world. You can say before anyone says any form of harassment or discrimination, I support queer people. I'm happy to work as an ally and get better as an ally. You can share that with people and say, I'm really concerned that queer people are being targeted and that increases their risk of suicide. I want to focus on how I can be a better support for them. Now, there's also some structural ones. So when we talk about gender neutral facilities, it is suicide prevention. So this last year alone, unfortunately, for trans and non-binary young folks who experience bathroom discrimination, 1 in 3 had a suicide attempt, with 1 in 5 experiencing multiple suicide attempts. Now, I know when it comes to gender inclusive facilities, whether that's gender neutral facilities or all gender, both terms work, but you might run into the really harmful myth that I hear sometimes. Well, someone is going to fake being trans to get into the bathroom to cause harm. 1, a bathroom sign has never prevented someone from causing harm. The bathroom symbol of sex assignment isn't what's preventing someone, but there's another logical flaw to that argument. And you can ask them this and say, hey, I want to make sure everyone can use the restroom safely. And it's currently not safe for trans and non-binary folks because of this kind of idea. But also, you're saying they're faking being trans, which means they're cisgender. So it sounds like you're afraid of cisgender folks. Let's talk about your fear of cis folks causing harm in the bathroom. You can also amplify queer voices. And I, of course, advocate share Trevor's resources. We have so many to share. But also look at what you love, whether it's sports, art, podcasts, books. Look for queer authors, queer creators, queer scientists. We exist in every field. Share what we're publishing, share what we're creating. Educate yourself on mental health resources. Make sure your policies include LGBTQ non-discrimination and mental health support. And then, of course, please oppose harmful legislation that targets our community, that puts our young folks in particular at really high risk of harm. Now, once again, I'm Kyle. My pronouns are she, her. I would love your feedback from today's session. And yes, a copy of what you see here today, because I know it's such a short time we get to be together, will be shared with our host to share with all attendees from today's session. So I'd appreciate your feedback, and I'll pop this in the chat as well, and it will be included in a follow-up email. But for those who'd like to stick around, if you have a minute or two, feel free to ask me a question, but I will also be available for email if you have a question you want to ask me directly. Thank you all so much for attending today, like I said.
And I'll just jump in here also, Dr. Teller, by thanking you for joining us for a second time and creating this opportunity for us to really sit with and learning and thinking more deeply about the risk of suicide in general for young people, but certainly in addition for those who identify as part of the queer community, and for focusing on interventions and protective factors. So thank you for this presentation. I will say quickly that the slides will be shared. I know that there's a time limit on our access to your information, But we will also have this recording posted to our website. And a quick thank you to my team member, Precious, for doing such a lovely job with the chat and reinforcing so many of the important points of this presentation. So like you said, if you're willing to stay on, Dr. Teller, for a few moments to look at any questions that may come into the chat. But for those of you who need to get back to your day, thank you for joining. And I will also just mention that November marks Transgender Awareness Week and Transgender Day of Remembrance. And Dr. Teller will be back to present again on November 18th. And that will be Trevor Project's Ally Training. So we hope to see many of you join us again in November. Thank you.
Oh, I'm seeing a question in the chat. So how can you book me for, or a teammate for presentation for members or allies? I'll follow up in an email, but you can reach out to our team just so that way you get access to most of our calendar at education@thetrevorproject.org. Usually I'm honestly one of the folks who's in there quite a bit, so you might even hear from me directly, but it gives you access to multiple calendars just so that way it's easier to book with us.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. And I can add that in a follow-up message for all of those who have joined today. We have the ability to keep track of who registered.
Perfect. Okay. Well, folks, I'm going to head out, but I appreciate every single person here today. And like I said, we'll have that follow-up message with the slide deck you saw here today. You'll have the recording on an internal website. And feel free to reach out if you do think of anything. I am very much that person who thinks of it a week or a month later. Like I said, contact me. And if I don't know something, I'll reach out to my team. They're incredible. And likely we can track down information if it relates to LGBTQ plus mental health for you. All right. Thank you, everyone.